My name is Anna Cave. I'm the director of the Ferencz International Justice Initiative, as you heard from Mark. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm the founding director of the Ferencz International Justice Initiative. It's the part of the museum that works on preventing and addressing contemporary genocide and crimes against humanity. I come most recently from a background at the State Department, where I worked on many of these issues in international justice and atrocity prevention, and at the National Security Council. And so it's a really great honor to work with and partner with the American Society of International Law. And you'll see tonight, I think, why that's such an important partnership for us. I wanted to just say a word about Ben Ferencz, who we are named after, of course. He is the last living prosecutor from Nuremberg. He is in his 99th year, and he's still going strong. He was the first person to use the word genocide in an international criminal trial, and it was at the urging of Raphael Lemkin. So it's fitting that we are here tonight in his name. Ben Ferencz and Raphael Lemkin helped build the international architecture. They literally gave us the words and the laws and the norms and the courts that we are trying to use today. And the Ferencz Initiative not only helps try to refine that, those legal norms and those laws on the books and works to make those courts more effective, but also to help victim groups actually utilize and access those courts. So we have started groups working with civil society and victim coalitions in Burma, in South Sudan, and Iraq to help them chart what that long path toward justice can look like, because it often does take 10, 20, 30 years. But the purpose of tonight's event is to really commemorate the legal giants that we're standing on their shoulders. And so tonight is really about commemorating the 70th anniversary. As part of that, we commissioned a study led by Todd, which he's going to talk a little bit about and preview tonight. It's forthcoming in February, about how the U.S. government makes genocide determinations. And this discussion is timely for at least two reasons. One, there's been a lot in the news recently about the genocide that has occurred in Burma. And the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum recently made an announcement and determination around genocide, saying that it has occurred, along with many other groups who have studied and have looked at the facts. We've sent fact-finding missions. We work closely with Rohingya and other ethnic minorities in Burma. So it's timely for that reason, because it's still happening today. And also on the legislative front, I thought I would mention that the Elie Wiesel Genocide Prevention Act passed the Senate by unanimous consent last evening. Has already passed the House, and it will probably need to be passed by the House again and then get to the President's desk. So these tools are ones that we are still wrestling with today, and that's what we hope to talk about this evening. I wanted to introduce the panelists. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because you have their very impressive bios, minus mine, right here on your flyer. And so I don't want to go through all of that today, but I encourage you to look at the wealth of experience that they bring. But instead, I wanted to talk a little bit, and I've asked them each to keep it lively this evening, to talk about a proudest moment or proudest achievement or something maybe that people don't know about themselves. But by way of introduction, I will say all of these three have, I think, spent time in the State Department Legal Advisor's Office, which I did as well in name only. And they might be three of the kindest, I don't know Sean quite as well, but I get the impression that you also fit into this category. Three of the kindest people and smartest people that I know, and I think that must be like a requirement. I don't know how I snuck in, but a requirement when they're hiring people for State Legal Advisor's Office, because they are truly, I've worked with Todd, who's my former boss. I worked with Avril when she was at the National Security Council. I haven't yet worked with you. Maybe that's in our future, but really, truly, three of the kindest people and smartest people I know. So with that, Todd, maybe you can introduce yourself with something that you're proud of or something unusual that you want this group to know this evening.
Oh, okay. Well, my name is Todd Buchwald. I was a career lawyer in the State Legal Advisor's Office for more years than I care to. I prefer not to say the exact number of years. I'm not sure I could even calculate it. I was the head of the Office of Political Military Affairs, and then the head of the Office of United Nations Affairs. And then in the latter parts of the Obama administration, I was named to head the Office of Global Criminal Justice until, more or less until I left the State Department in, I guess sort of at the end of last year. And an interesting thing about myself is that I was a person that Sean replaced, actually, which is a great claim to fame for me, that I had a job that Sean had before Sean did. So that's what I'd like people to know. And he was kind.
All right, Avril, over to you.
So I was also a lawyer in the legal advisor's office, as has already been indicated. I worked in the private international law and then treaty affairs and political military affairs, and then went to the Hill and came back and was a lawyer that headed the treaty office for a few years, which was probably my favorite job in my career. And then went to do, I was the NSC legal advisor and then worked at the CIA and then came back to the National Security Council. But in terms of, you asked what we were proud of, and I have to say, I really tried to give it some thought. Unlike you, Tom.
Unlike me.
Exactly. No, it's just that I do think that it's very hard to claim credit for really almost anything that you do in government because there's so many people involved, and it seems outrageous to suggest, this was the thing. And honestly, I think when I just when I think about what I am most proud of, I think I'm most proud of having served in a whole series of communities within government with people who I thought were extraordinary, who much like the two people that are sitting next to me, who contributed to a culture and a legacy of work that they thought was really worthwhile and could bring value to the United States government. And honestly, Elle was the first place that I experienced that, but I saw that in other places. And it really was the first place where I started to understand the culture and the value of being a government lawyer and what it meant to really try to bring to your client sort of the best understanding of the law and the landscape that you're within, and the integrity that comes with that, and watching some really extraordinary people around me, sort of bring the best. And there's this one Churchill quote that I particularly, hopefully I won't mess it up for you, but it's basically something to the effect of, character may be manifest in the great moments, but it's made in the small moments. And I feel as if, honestly, there were thousands of those small moments in government. Many of them occurred in meetings, which is very unfortunate because I hate meetings. But it's truly, it's one of those things where I feel as if all of those small moments were places where I got to be proud of the people I got to work with and time with. But that's from me.
Sure.
Well, thanks, Ian. I must say I completely forgot you were going to ask us to say something about us that people didn't know. I was about to do the one that Todd just did, but that doesn't work so well. So I am Sean Murphy. I'm a full-time professor at George Washington University Law School. I'm also the president of the American Society. I'm very proud to have that role. And I'm also a member of the UN International Law Commission, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about that as it relates to tonight's topic. I guess maybe I'll say two short things about my connection to The Hague. One is that when I joined the State Department, and it's interesting you said that we're all nice, but we also all have left L, so I don't know if that says anything. It shouldn't. That was a wonderful place. When I first joined the State Department, there was a case, the U.S. versus Italy, at the International Court of Justice. For some reason, nobody in L wanted to work on that case, and I'm immediately raising my hand. So within a year of joining the State Department, I'm arguing before the ICJ. And I'm not sure about this because I've never really checked it. I think I might be the youngest American ever to plead at the ICJ. I was 27 at the time. Second thing I'll say about it is years after that, I went to The Hague for the State Department as the legal counselor at the American Embassy. and I definitely won't take any credit for this, but when I got there, Dusan Tadic was the only person in custody at the ICTY, and when I left 3 years later, there were 33 people in custody. So won't take any credit, but it's kind of a fun time to be there.
That's great. So one last little note that I'm going to take the prerogative as the moderator to talk to Avril about what it was like to be the first woman deputy director of the CIA. I think they call it DDCIA, right?
Yes.
And maybe if you have any, since there are unfortunately so few women in those senior positions, if you can talk to us a little bit about either what that was like, or if you have any thoughts about people that are thinking about pursuing a career in government, and what that was like for you to chart some unknown waters.
You really know you've made it when you're represented by an acronym. I mean, it's like the moment that anyway. No, it's I guess maybe to try to keep it short. I think it felt very different depending on different levels of my career, to be honest. I started off in physics, and I was the only girl in my class at University of Chicago in physics class, the graduating class, and I felt this enormous pressure, honestly, not to ask a stupid question or say something stupid, because I felt as if I would represent all women. You know, that people would say, "Oh my God, women can't do physics," and I'd be like, "No, it's just me, just an idiot." But that felt very different than when I went into law school, and it was mostly like 50% women. And when I was in Al, it was not sort of top of mind. I mean, there were definitely other moments. I remember hearing from Jamie Borick, wear a suit every day as a woman, because people will think that you're the secretary or the administrative assistant, things like that. And so there are things, but it was not. I sort of didn't want to talk about the fact that I was a woman. For the most part, I wanted to sort of do my job and be graded on my professional results. And when I took the position at the CIA. Because you're the first woman, there's all of this stuff, but there was a moment for me where I was going around to different parts of the agency to, introduce yourself and learn about what other people are doing and so on. And not much older, I suppose, but in her 50s, maybe late 50s, early 60s, a woman came up to me, and she broke into tears and just sort of said, been waiting so long to see a woman in that position and to rise through the ranks. And it brought me back to my physics class. I felt this sense of responsibility, like, do not screw this up. But it was also just, it was one of a series of data points that sort of said, this is something I need to embrace and think about and talk about and actually deal with it. And for, many of you who are already managers, to the extent that you happen to be students and you're thinking about careers and so on, I think in addition to the challenges that you may feel and sort of working through these issues for yourself in a career, I think one of the key things to think about too is how should I encourage diversity through my management style? And that was something that we really spent a lot of time on at the agency. How do we encourage diversity in the workplace? And I think it's both understanding that, various groups, for a variety of reasons, have special, they may have additional stress as a consequence of the, prejudice that they're dealing with. There can be a whole series of things. You may want to create an environment that tries to draw out the best in everybody and, sort of think about how to do that. There's a whole series of things that I think are worth thinking through. And there's the final point, just is, for me, I think being a leader as a woman is one of those things where I remember we did a 360 analysis. If any of you have gone through this, we were trying to promote this. So everybody, above you, below you, everybody sort of gives you their view. And I scored super low on executive presence, right? Like, was like smart and capable and all of these other things. It was great, but John Brennan, who was the director of the CIA at the time, we would joke about it, like he could just walk into a room and have executive presence, right? And, he was just this big guy, looked intimidating.
He had a deep voice.
He had a deep voice. I know I have to work on this, and sorry about my voice tonight. But in any event, so and I felt, I thought a lot about that, and it seemed to me that I had to understand that that's how people perceived me. and that there is a part of leadership that's basically reflecting confidence and ensuring that the people around you see you as a confident leader, that you can take them through. But I also wanted to change a little bit the way that people perceive leaders, and that they can come in different models. And so there's sort of a sweet spot in there. And one of the greatest gifts I guess I got as going through this process was that somebody came up to me and said to me after close to 2 years of the agency, that said that basically he saw that leaders could come in different forms, and I think that was it was nice to hear, and it was nice to experience that. So that's fine. Sorry, too long.
Thank you for your service. So tonight we wanted to talk and do something a little bit different, which is we're going to intersperse clips from Watchers of the Sky, which is really about Lemkin's story, Raphael Lemkin's story. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion interspersed with these clips about that in kind of three ways. One, the importance of the word genocide. Two, the use of the word genocide by the US government. And then three, lessons of the past inform what we're thinking about in the future, particularly as it relates to crimes against humanity. So let's maybe go to the first clip.
Dr. Lemkin, could you give us a little background on how you came to be interested in this genocide fight originally?
It leads me very far back to my childhood. Everybody has sentimental memories from childhood, and everybody has a book he loved most. One of my inspiration in this field was a book by Sienkiewicz, Quo Vadis, which described the terrible sufferings of early Christians. Later on, I became interested in genocide because it happened so many times.
Most people don't believe that other people are capable of these kinds of crimes, even today. But Lemkin knew.
In Rwanda, up to 200,000 people have died in a month.
About 1.3 million Syrians have fled their country's bloody two-year conflict.
Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir has been accused of masterminding a campaign of genocide in Darfur.
One of the problems that some survivors have, it is to accept how their beloved ones were killed. I'm myself a survivor of genocide. I might say that if today is Darfur, tomorrow it might be somewhere else.
As a lawyer, I thought crime should not be punished by the victims, but should be punished by international law.
Lemkin came with a new idea. To transform these massacres into a crime, use the law to bind humanity, to prevent crimes. And that was the vision of Lemkin.
Lemkin will look back, wherever he may be in heaven, or if there is such a place, if they ever give me a pass to go up there, he'll be saying, look, everybody knows about genocide. Everybody condemns genocide. They still commit it. But nevertheless, in principle, they have come a long way. And I say, look, you can only build this temple of the law one stone at a time. And I am a builder of that temple. I'm putting one stone on it at a time.
So for those of you who don't know Raphael Lemkin's story, he was a refugee. He was a Polish lawyer, and his 49 members of his family were killed in the Holocaust. He fled as a refugee in about 1941, and he pleaded with his family to leave with him because he saw the markers of what was going to happen and what was happening. And so he arrives in the U.S. and he is just feeling completely helpless about what he can do, knowing his family is being targeted in Poland and throughout Europe. And he starts to think about, why don't we have a name for this? Why is the killing of 1 million a lesser crime than the crime of murdering one individual? And he starts thinking about how to name this crime, right? Which before this had no name. And he starts thinking about what that could be, and he comes up with this word, genocide. And so he then not only names the crime, but decides, and he tries to get the Nuremberg prosecutors and to use the word. In fact, Ben does use it, but it's not actually integrated into the legal framework of Nuremberg. And so following that, he decides he's going to come up with a framework, a legal framework, a convention designed to obligate nations to prevent and punish and then cooperate in the extradition of alleged perpetrators. So if we can come back to this if we can get it working, but maybe we can just go straight into the discussion. Maybe first a question for you, Sean. As we're thinking about what it means to define genocide, in 1944 and then ultimately in 1948, when the convention is actually adopted, what's the significance? Take us through what that significance is at that time under international law, and what did states and advocates think that was going to accomplish?
Sure. So, as Anna just said, I think the striking thing about genocide is that even though the Holocaust had occurred, and even though the Nuremberg Tribunal was convened, knowing about those atrocities, the term genocide actually is not in the Nuremberg Charter. So there were headings of jurisdiction, including crimes against humanity and war of aggression and things like that, but not the heading of genocide. So there are no individuals indicted at Nuremberg for genocide. You did have Raphael Lemkin kind of running around trying to get, Robert Jackson to put genocide in the Nuremberg Charter, trying to get the prosecutors at Nuremberg to, if not indict, at least somehow talk about it. And, there were some trials, including the one that Ben was responsible for, where the talk did include the term genocide. But at the end of the day, it's a concept that most prosecutors resisted at Nuremberg because of a belief that it had not been codified either in the Nuremberg Charter or anywhere else, and that you shouldn't be prosecuting someone for a crime that wasn't known to them at the time that they would have committed it. In fact, some of the other things in the Nuremberg Charter also, you could say that the defendants didn't know about, but it wasn't even in the Nuremberg Charter. So instead, at Nuremberg, you have prosecutors certainly going after members of the Third Reich for committing murder as a part of their racist ideology, but not as genocide per se. So I think that by the time you get to 1948, Lemkin's initiative is to get it codified, to get it clearly stated in a major international treaty that will thereafter allow, at both the international and at the national level, the possibility of prosecuting individuals for essentially a group crime, a crime against a group of people based on certain types of characteristics. I guess I would also say that I think the Genocide Convention ultimately carries forward the intellectual breakthrough at Nuremberg, because really Nuremberg stands, at least in part, for the proposition that it is an international crime when you do things that are even against your own population. So crimes against humanity can just be you're killing X million people that are your own people. And the Nuremberg precedent then set that certainly for international courts, but the Genocide Convention is the first time that we see it introduced in the context of obligations on states to prevent and punish this crime, which again could be not of some other country harming your people, but some other country harming its own people. And so one way to think about the 1948 Genocide Convention is the first, certainly post-war human rights treaty. Pre-World War II, you could point to some of the anti-slavery conventions and things like that and say those are kind of forerunners to human rights treaties. But post-World War II, this is even before the Universal Declaration. As Mark said, it came the next day, right? But it's well before treaties that would address prevention and punishment and human rights more generally. So well before the two covenants on civil and political rights and economic and social rights, well before the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, discrimination against women, torture, you can go on and on. This is the first of those treaties that's saying it's not okay for states to do acts, including acts against their own people. So in a way, it unleashes the possibility of all these other treaties in the time thereafter. Last thing I'll say is that it then opened up the possibility for prosecutions at the national level. In the wake of ratifying the Genocide Convention, many countries began adopting national laws on genocide. We're here in the United States. The U.S., after it ratifies the Genocide Convention, adopts the Genocide Convention Implementation Statute. Many countries, of course, by virtue of being a monist system, take the treaty and receive it into their national law without the need for a statute. But in any event, you suddenly get an array of national laws. Doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of national prosecutions. And so there's an interesting issue there. Eichmann in Israel is the first, and there's not that many thereafter. But nevertheless, creating that sense as a part of national law that this is not okay and should be condemned and ostracized. And of course, it's then fed into cases at the International Court of Justice. You know, Serbia being sued by Bosnia, by Croatia. The International Law Commission did work, including the 1954 draft code on offenses that included genocide within it. The UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, once established, often speaks about genocide, and we even now have a Secretary General representative on genocide in New York. So it's had a pretty huge effect, I think, in taking the ideas of Nuremberg and pushing them forward to a future generation.
That's great. Are we, maybe we'll... I think we're ready.
You feel this guilt on your heart. You would have done much more to save them. And this is this kind of experience you live with. You cannot explain to someone. Sometimes it's even, you feel even ashamed that you didn't do anything. But actually you could not do anything because the negative forces were strong. But you never have this quietness of your spirit, of your heart. The human nature keeps on telling you should have done much more.
The sense that he had of having failed his neighbors, failed his family, failed his community, and the idea that you could just be patient while that kind of mass slaughter was going on, that was just anathema for him. He harnessed this pain and he put tremendous thought into what it is the U.S. government should be doing in order to stop the extermination of the Jews. What that provoked in him was this idea, maybe if I had a better word, if I'd had a better name, then, maybe then, if the crime has a name, governments will see how qualitatively and quantitatively different it is, and maybe then they'll band together to do what they should do. Lemkin's notebooks from that period forward are filled with efforts to come up with a word, a new word, to capture the crime that he'd been committed to banning his entire adult life, but in a way that would cast an instant stigma on anybody committing this crime. But in the end, what he settles on is a Greek-Latin hybrid, genos, people, tribe, race, with the Latin sedere, side, for killing or destroying. You see it in the notebooks, him, kind of trying different things out and then settling upon this word, which he thinks can in fact connote that moral judgment that he feels is necessary.
So that's a great segue to my next question and kind of a topic for us to consider. And that is the meaning of the word genocide and why there is this disconnect between our legal definition and our common understanding of the word genocide, and what are the ramifications of that? What leads to this difference in views, and what are the ramifications? So Todd, I thought I might, in light of your research with us over the last 6 to 9 months, kind of reflect on that.
Right. It's really interesting to think about the word, as you see, is sort of chosen to be evocative, and it's sort of wrapped in emotion, and sort of people sort of feel it emotionally, and there's a common perception of the word, and then yet there's a technical definition in the Genocide Convention, which is negotiated by states after Lemkin has come up with the idea, and sort of states are making trade-offs and trying to adjust the word here, adjust the word there to sort of to protect their own perspectives and interests. To a normal person, it tends to evoke the idea of a little bit of that. It sort of feels like that which the Nazis did, right? It is, or another way to look at it sometimes is, it's that which is sort of worthy of the kind of response that should have been made to the Nazis. It's sort of a level of, it gives rise to a level of emotion. It's usually often mixed in with a sense of an intent to destroy, right? That it's all these horrible things happening with an intent to destroy the target group. But there are very different perceptions of what it means to destroy a group. So that's the sort of common perception. And there is also a sense that if a set of crimes characterized as genocide, the government or other international actors will respond more to it. So there's a sort of instrumental advantage to having a set of atrocities characterized as genocide. The definition, as I say, is, it's a legal definition. And, I noticed on there, when they, in Lemkin's books, at the end there, they had a definition, and it's not really the definition in the treaty. It's close, but it's hard to sort of nail it down. In the treaty, it's the various killing of members of the group and other sort of similar acts, and then the sort of hard part of it is that they are done with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And when something is so important, you have so many lawyers looking at it, it's not just that the common perception doesn't necessarily match the lawyer's perception of what it means, but lawyers have different perceptions of that also. And when you start thinking about it, you can see there's lots of different ways to think about what it might mean that have importance for deciding, what's within this group, what's within this universe called genocide, and what isn't. Just to name a couple of sort of notable elements, the list of groups is national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So if you're a different kind of group, even if you have intent to destroy that other kind of group, like a social group or an economic group, it's not within this definition genocide. Some normal person who calls it genocide isn't wrong about it. It just isn't sort of the definition that lawyers use or that the government uses when it's deciding whether to characterize a set of atrocities as genocide. It talks about, I mentioned the idea of destroying the group. And destroy the group is, the courts have tended to look at that in the sense of destroying the group in sort of like a biological or annihilating the members of the group, killing the members of the group, as opposed to destroying the ability of the group to sort of function as a group. So you see in places like Bosnia, in many of the places where genocide is an issue, people will struggle with, well, what's the purpose here? Is the purpose to destroy the group, annihilate all its members, or is it just to drive the people out? And we're going to kill a lot of people and drive them out. And it makes for some unsatisfying kind of discussions, like, well, why should that matter in terms of what, the government does as a response? But it becomes, it's an elusive element of the definition. And then because the definition depends on the intent of the perpetrators, it's just hard to sometimes know for sure. So you have, cases like the Nazis where the intent is self-evident. It's an announced intent. And maybe in Rwanda, it's sort of an announced intent. But oftentimes the intent has to be inferred. And the courts have tended, in the cases that have come before the ICJ and the International Criminal Court, maybe for reasons having to do with their function as a court as opposed to what government should do, but they tend to say things like, it really needs to be very firmly established. It can be the kind of thing where there's no, where other inferences couldn't justifiably be drawn. So so it's often a subject of debate, of public debate, of frustration within the government because it's hard to sort of explain to people. It's hard to come to terms with what it means. And there are things also in the definition that seem to work in opposite directions. So, for example, destroy in a physical, if you sort of think about what Lemkin wrote about the sort of special eliminationist harm of genocide, one of the things he writes is it robs mankind of the contributions the group would have made, right? And that's a special harm beyond just mass murder, right? And yet, in the definition, it's destroy the group in whole or in part. So, if you're destroying the group in part, it's horrible. And, what's a sufficiently significant part? And how does that fit in with the idea that the special harm is to make it so that there can be no contribution from that group going forward? So there are just a lot of issues that have to be sort of worked through, and they're sort of a little bit unsatisfactory to think about because you're left sometimes with the feeling like anything that's important enough that would be worthy of consideration about whether it is genocide must already be enough to warrant the response that is, that is demanded.
So I thought now having kind of considered the backdrop of 1948, considered the word, thought a little bit about Raphael Lemkin and what he was thinking, now kind of pivot to how has the U.S. government both applied the convention and how have they analyzed that? What does that look like? And we're going to do a clip now of maybe the most well-known, which is how the U.S. government handled talking about Rwanda.
On that, or a view as to whether or not what is happening could be genocide?
Well, as I think you know, the use of the term genocide has a very precise legal meaning, although it's not strictly a legal determination. There are other factors in there as well. When in looking at a situation to make a determination about that, before we begin to use that term.
Curiosity, given that so many people say that there is genocide underway or something that strongly resembles it, why wouldn't this convention be involved?
Well, I think, as you know, this becomes a legal definitional thing, unfortunately, in terms of as horrendous as all these things are, there becomes a definitional question.
So that's deeply unsatisfying, right? And so I thought maybe next turn to Avril and Todd, and I think we should all chime in. So if you all have thoughts on comments that you're making, please chime in. So since the end of the Cold War, Todd, right, you've looked at the various cases. There have been about 5 that the State Department eventually made statements that genocide has occurred or is occurring. Bosnia in 93, Rwanda in 94, Iraq in 95, Darfur in 2004, and areas under ISIS control in 2016 and 2017. So the museum has commissioned a study that Todd has led, which I mentioned, and we have an advisory board that Avril and John Bellinger have also supported in providing support to that project. Essentially trying to look at what has the process been that the U.S. government has undertaken to come to that conclusion? And how can we make it more effective? What are some of the ways that we can make that process of coming to using the word genocide by a senior U.S. government official, usually the Secretary of State, how can we make that more effective? All three of us lived through the ISIS determination, and I think in some ways found it not entirely satisfactory. And so we wanted to help peel back the layers of that and understand what that process has been. So Todd, maybe to start with you, can you talk a little bit about what is the process that leads or prompts the Secretary of State or another senior government U.S. official to eventually say, yes, genocide has occurred? You know, we see Secretary Albright kind of seeming to evade that. How has that developed over time?
And the press spokesperson, when I was in I would say to myself almost every day, there was no job I would like less than being the press spokesperson. And it reminded me why. It's painful to watch. It's painful as I work and do the research. It's painful to sort of just read the stories from back then. You can sort of feel how awkward the whole thing is. When you look at it historically, I sort of have divided it up into sort of three not very scientific phases or stages. So there's the way genocide was talked about sort of, from the earliest cases that we looked at until sort of the Cold War, through the end of the Cold War period. And the general takeaway from it is that only over time does the sense that of advocates using the idea of getting the government to say that genocide has occurred as a way to get them to do things that you want them to do. So it's discussed earlier. It doesn't seem to have a big process around it. It's important. It's an important word. It's evocative and so forth. But it's sort of like more a part of the normal governmental process. There are some amazing episodes or stories that you sort of come across. President Nixon talking about genocide in Burundi and, excoriating the State Department for not paying attention to it. I mean, it's really sort of, and some of it's on tape, interestingly enough. It wasn't in the 18 and a half minutes. But just really, really interesting stuff. But where it starts to sort of emerge, or the antecedents of what, we think of as the process now, started to come into being with Bosnia and Rwanda. But Bosnia and Rwanda are sort of funny cases in the sense that what you have is advocates within the government, especially in Bosnia for a longer period of time, advocates within the government trying to get the, what we call the secretary, the senior decision makers, to use the word and not being successful. I mean, they want a statement that genocide is occurring in Bosnia. And they think that making the statement will generate either legal or political pressure, and that's why they want it. They think it's happening too, but they want it to happen. And in Rwanda, you see that a little bit also. Rwanda happens while the Bosnia story is really sort of still just playing out. And in Bosnia, what happened was there was, it was not said, the word was avoided. And eventually, the department started using the phrase acts of genocide. And the clip, that part of the clip wasn't there, but acts of genocide is perceived as sort of evasive. What are you talking about, acts of genocide? At one point, there's a press conference where I think the same press spokesperson is asked, well, how many acts of genocide does it take to be genocide, right? And there's nothing inherently wrong with the phrase acts of genocide. It's but it just felt evasive. And Rwanda sort of was happening sort of at the same time, and there was it was not that long until the word was used, but it felt like a long time considering how obvious it was about what was going on. So that was in the 90s. There were some other cases in the 90s too. The Iraq case is a really interesting case. It's not really known about. And, we sort of stumbled across it, and there was a decision in the mid-90s that was not publicized, was not intended to be publicized, that the Iraqis were responsible for genocide in the late 80s. There was, I won't go into sort of all the details about it. And in Kosovo, there was sort of a conscious or conscious-ish decision to talk about to try to sort of divert away from a discussion of whether genocide was or wasn't occurring, and towards a discussion of there are risks of genocide, there are indicators of genocide, and that was it worked in that environment. Maybe because, you know, there was a U.S. and NATO air campaign anyway. There wasn't sort of the dynamic of, well, if only we could get the government to say genocide, maybe they do something, because the government was, you know, a very proactive policy. So anyway, the seeds of the Bosnia-Rwanda process included sort of memorandum to the secretary, sort of informed by legal tabs and analysis and sort of information from INR presented for the secretary's decision. By the time we get to Darfur, which is the next big one in 2004, it's a very different dynamic because you don't have that same sense of perception of resistance. And at least the sort of common understanding of what happened is that Secretary Powell at the time was very willing to use the word genocide if it could be established through a proper process that in fact it met the definition that it was genocide. And I think he had the sense that it was sort of useful to sort of, for the same kind of reasons, to help rally the international community, I think is what he had in mind. Whether it did or didn't, I'm not really sure, but that was part of the process. You didn't have that same sense of resistance. And so they went about it more methodically. They established this atrocity documentation team and went out and interviewed people and got information, came back with the information, sort of analyzed it, put together the case, went up, sort of spoke with Powell, who sort of, you know, struggled with it for a little bit, and then announced on the basis of all this information that, you know, that he believed the genocide had occurred, and said who he thought was responsible for it. The next big case really is the case with ISIS in 2016 with Secretary Kerry and then Secretary Tillerson in 2017, and that was a somewhat different dynamic, but again, not the sense of resistance from the higher levels of the State Department. It fit into the narrative. They were, you know, that they were the narrative that was true about the sort of horrible nature of ISIS and so forth. And but it became a political issue a little bit because the president, when he'd authorized the use of force in 2014, had talked in terms of a possible genocide against the Yazidis in northern Iraq. And so he'd sort of used the word already. He didn't say it was happening, but he used the word, he'd put it into play. But it became an issue people were concerned about, well, you're saying it here, you're going to say that ISIS committed genocide against the Yazidis, but there's a lot of other things going on in the world. Who else in Iraq? Is ISIS responsible also for genocide against other Christians, Shia Muslim, other groups? And you know, you're talking here about you know, ISIS crimes in Iraq. What are you going to say about Syria right across the border there? In fact, what's the story around the world? I mean, what's the selectivity bias here, and how are you sort of dealing with it? And it was a hard issue. And eventually there was a piece of legislation, you know, that required a report. And the reporting requirement was sort of successful in, or an action forcing event to sort of get us to get the State Department to say something. But it was a hard issue because the issues of selectivity bias are real, and it's hard to sort of explain exactly what attracts the attention and what doesn't attract the attention. But again, there was no atrocity documentation team for Iraq because it was not the same kind of dynamic on the ground, but it was a similar kind of thing of people in the Intelligence Bureau and in my former office in the Office of Global Criminal Justice and the Human Rights Bureau and so forth, pouring through, and I should say also a lot of the sort of evidence of ISIS's intent was sort of public, because they weren't shy about what they were trying to accomplish. But people pouring through the record and sort of putting it together, and there were key NGOs that put together reports and so forth to sort of assemble the information. And now in Myanmar, the basic idea of the atrocity documentation team has been used also. So the information has been assembled, and we don't actually know how it's going to sort of turn out. The State Department hasn't said anything yet. I guess today the House voted, 345 to 1, some huge vote. I can't remember exactly, but it's encouraging the State Department to sort of call genocide by its name and sort of asserting that it's an important thing to do, both morally and for instrumental reasons.
So, Avril, I don't know if you want to comment on anything that Todd has said, but also thinking about, your natural inclination is, of course, there are obligations that this convention has imposed. What is this State Department? What is the U.S. government? What are states? What do they have to do? So can you talk to us a little bit about how the U.S. government has interpreted its legal obligations, and also how other states potentially have interpreted their obligations, and then, of course, anything you want to kind of react to, having lived through this as well?
Yeah, sure. It's and both Todd and Sean can also add to what I have to say, because these are really the experts in this area. I think there is an expectation, right, that somehow the fact of genocide, a determination of genocide, must implicate essentially a state responsibility to take action for the circumstances. And the way the U.S. government has looked at it, when you look at the treaty itself, there's actually relatively few sort of stark obligations that inure to the parties. There's Article 1, which is sort of the most well-known in terms of sort of, I think you have the language, but it basically indicates that a state has to undertake to prevent and punish, I believe is the language. And basically, thank you. Look at the very lawyers between the three of us. But in any event, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I think there's also an obligation to, to pass legislation to give effect to the convention. There's also an extradite and prosecute regime, in a sense, in a kind of traditional way. But it's the prevent and punish piece that I think most people focus in on and say, well, don't you have an obligation to prevent and punish genocide, particularly in taking a determination? And the U.S. government has taken the view that really that obligation is about preventing and punishing it within your own territory. And that has been, there have been different views on that. The International Court of Justice and the court that Sean mentioned earlier in the Bosnia v. Serbia court decision basically indicated that no, there is actually an obligation that goes further than that. But it said, there is an obligation outside of your territory, but it also stopped short of suggesting that, for example, that obligation goes to the point of creating or, in fact, requiring a country to take military action in effect, a sort of a use of force base. But instead, it looks at the obligation as being related to basically your ability to influence through diplomatic or other measures, essentially, in order to prevent and punish in this sense. And so the U.S. has taken actually quite a constrained perspective on what the obligation is in the context of determination. But I would say that there is still a number of things that, frankly, it represents, at least from my perspective. I think one is, and we've talked about this in the context of the report and otherwise, but you're bearing witness and you're making an historical record, and that can be a value of a sort. And I think, for me personally, at the very least, I think in this context where you have a crime where it's there's an intent to destroy in whole or in part, as Todd reflected the language of the convention, but really a group of people, there's a sense of trying to eliminate their history and eliminate who they are, and bearing witness to it is meaningful in a sense, and creating that record and saying something about it is, I think, important in the piece. There's also, an effort to really motivate, in effect, as Todd said, and I think this is a big motivator and incentive for why people want to have a determination be made, is because there's a sense of, there is a pressure that you feel, reflected in some respects by the words that were highlighted in the comment, that you can't just sit and watch this, you have to do something about it. And that pressure, I think, manifests itself in a variety of ways. Inside of governments, I saw officials, feel a sense of this is something we have to deal with. I don't think that's restricted, by the way, to genocide. I think crimes against humanity and other grave crimes, it's needs to be addressed. But you also see it from Congress, and there's sort of more of a dialogue about it, naming and doing it in a sense. I think another piece of it is laying a groundwork for accountability in a sense. That you are going to hopefully prosecute and hold people accountable for this and do a variety of things. And so, naming it and beginning to amass the record that Todd reflected, can be part of the decision and can be a piece of this. I think another piece is just hoping to deter, frankly, the continued commission of facts, and hoping in the event that as you're looking and making determinations, that there's a sense of, well, there could be a determination made, and we want to avoid that kind of a determination. And I think fair, reasonable minds can question whether or not that has any impact under the circumstances. But I think in the context of ISIS, people made arguments, at least, that by naming genocide, that there might be some concerns that people would have in the context of being recruited by ISIS, that they wouldn't want to participate in something that was of a crime of the sort. So, to the extent that that actually does something, that's a kind of a question, I think, for people. But there are also, and that's not an exhaustive list, but I think there's also critiques to it. And, this is certainly one of the things that, again, as we've said, as you noted, we've all lived through a piece of this, in the ISIS one in particular, I think, was one where there was a sense that almost by naming genocide with respect to the Yazidis, but not calling it genocide with respect to Christians, Shia Muslims, others who were essentially, being killed and for which there was terrific tragedies occurring, that you were somehow weighing these crimes and suggesting that the Yazidi crime was more grave, in a sense, and thereby diluting or somehow taking away something from the horrors that were occurring to other people in this context. And that was a challenge. And I think another critique that that is just an issue is just whether or not you then enter into this very legalistic conversation as opposed to a really serious conversation about what is the policy, what do we need to be doing about this, and does it matter that it's genocide versus crimes against humanity or another piece of this? And so all of these things were, I think, packed into the conversation. And I'm sure you guys have more to add to this.
So it does strike me that one of the, so there's a pressure because genocide has this sort of special resonance. It puts a lot of pressure on the decision whether to call something genocide. And I think one thing looking forward that people should think about, the government should think about, we should all think about, is the point that Avril was getting at, which is, you have this word that describes certain atrocities as, within the definition of genocide, and you have some things sort of like right outside the circle that aren't maybe genocide, or that you can't establish your genocide, and it doesn't really mean they're less worthy of a response. And I think that thought has to be more forcefully expressed. And if you think about it, it's happened. There have been efforts. If you look back at the responsibility to protect provisions that the United Nations adopted, that the United States supported, John Bolton, ambassador at the time, supported, the entire government supported. They talk about not an obligation, but a responsibility, sort of a similar kind of thing without the legalness to it. And it's not limited to genocide. It's genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, right? And that sort of gets at it. And if you think of the 2008 Albright-Cohen report, talks about the relevant group as the words they use repeatedly throughout are genocide and other mass atrocities, and they describe part of it as to sort of come up with a form of words that makes the response not depend on how the question of whether genocide has occurred is being litigated. So the idea of genocide and other mass atrocities, and also in PSD10, they use the same word, genocide and other mass atrocities. And I think that's a good way to think about it. The genocide is special, but it doesn't mean that something that isn't, genocide, that doesn't somehow fit within the definition, is less worthy of response, or sort of somehow a second-class crime.
That's great. I want to leave time for questions at the end, so I want to go ahead and turn to and pivot to our kind of last segment, which is really thinking about the lessons from Lemkin's advocacy and what can we learn for that, for today's efforts on a Crimes Against Humanity Convention. So let's turn to our last clip.
We need deeds, not words. Show us the deeds. Give us proof of good faith. Let us deal with the deadly weapons. Let's open our countries to inspection, all of us. Let's open up the world and let light and knowledge come in and see what each other's doing.
Lemkin went back to the books, as it were. He went back to what he had tried to do, which is to ensure that a legal convention was put in place in order to ban genocide. The first step that he took in order to see the crime prohibited was to try to get countries in the brand new United Nations to just pass a resolution.
Lemkin found something that is still valid. The idea small countries can play together and define limits.
Amazingly, he secured the passage of a genocide resolution, which in turn paved the way for the creation of a convention. The next task became get enough countries to ratify the convention to create the first ever piece of international human rights law.
To kick things off on talking to us a little bit about the procedural, the process to get to the Genocide Convention, and reflecting maybe are we in a different time now? Does Lemkin's advocacy efforts, does that bear on what we might do today? And then I'm going to turn to you next, John.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because it's in many respects the story of U.S. ratification of the Genocide Convention, I think, is a kind of a prelude to what we're experiencing today. And I think the resolution that Samantha was speaking of was, I think it was December 11th, 1946. And in about 2 years, they had produced a convention for which there was the adoption on December 9th, 1948. And that was about right for how long it would take to develop treaties for that period in a sense. And that's just, so the adoption by the UN General Assembly is just a kind of a closing of the text, right? And then the United States was, I think, the first country to sign. It was only 2 days later when it was open for signature, and the United States signed the treaty on December 11th, 1948. And then it took about 6 months for the treaty to be sent to the Senate. And that was by President Truman at that time. And again, that takes, the process is such that convention is negotiated, there's a decision to sign, and then you produce this transmittal package, which back then, by the way, were a lot shorter than the transmittal packages. I just want to say we worked much harder in the treaty office as it got later on. But it was quite a process, you make sure that you're writing up the United States, the executive branch's perspective on each of these articles and what it means and what are the obligations and so on. And that gets sent to the Senate, and then the Senate is essentially receives it, and it goes to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for review, and hearings will be held and so on. And there it sat for many, many, many years, and it's really, I mean, it's there was an extraordinary amount of ink spilled and work done on the treaty. And in fact, I think during that period, to your point, Nixon actually sent up a message, because once the treaty goes to the Senate, it sits there until it's returned, right? But so you'll find that there are treaties that have been there for many, many years. And so there's really nothing for the executive branch to do other than to keep saying to the Senate, please, would you take this up, right? We would like to have you do that, right? And we see each president basically does that. And Nixon actually sent up a message urging the Senate to take action on the Genocide Convention, which was wholly unsuccessful. And, and so it continued, right? And then I was looking up, and so it happens finally in February of 1986, February 19th, 1986, that it's approved by the Senate, 83-11. And prior to that period, Jesse Helms was among sort of the biggest opponents, essentially, of the Genocide Convention. And he has this sort of famous quote about the idea that he wants to protect the United States from the interference of the international legal regime, right? And it's a sort of a a bumper sticker almost for much of the dispute that was happening in the context of this treaty and in a variety of other raised as well. But this sense that somehow the convention would force us, that international law was coming in and would force us to do things that were inconsistent with the Constitution, or that were somehow giving up and ceding our sovereignty in a variety of ways, and that this was unacceptable and it shouldn't be resisted. And Lugar actually, I think, was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time that it passed through Lugar. Senator Lugar was actually somebody who really took up a number of treaties during his time as chairmanship and different things. He tried the Law of the Sea Convention, also that didn't work out so well. But there are a number of other treaties that he tried that were very good. But it's in a way, I worked for then Chairman Biden of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 110th Congress, when Lugar was ranking, and having watched the two of them and having watched how Lugar works, you can see in a way his efforts to find compromise through the resolution that's passed when the Senate basically approves a treaty. And the resolution has in it 2 reservations, I think it's 5 understandings, and 1 declaration. And in the reservations, what you have is a reservation that basically says, even though the treaty provides jurisdiction to the International Court of Justice, the reservation says they will not have jurisdiction unless the United States consents, right? So that's the first thing, and that's a very classic issue that we've experienced in modern thing, and maybe I'll leave you to talk about the modern craziness. But in any event, that was one, right? And is a sort of a classic reservation. And then another reservation has to do with the Constitution, that nothing in this treaty can force the United States to do anything that's sort of, inconsistent with the Constitution. And it's in a way, a language that makes it clear that the United States is self-judging, right? Where there might be some kind of conflict with the Constitution, which if you're on the international side of this, looking at this, right, you sort of say, that's great. Your reservation is one that allows you basically to decide which of these requirements are in fact consistent with your Constitution or inconsistent with your Constitution, and then you don't have to comply with those as a matter of domestic law, right? So problematic. And then there's these series of understandings, and at least 2 of the understandings, from some people's perspectives, there were a number of critiques, right, were not really understandings, which are typically sort of, we interpret this provision in the following way, but that interpretation is a kind of reasonable interpretation of the provision, but instead reservations in effect, because it talks about when Todd talked about the definition of genocide and talked about destroying a group in whole or in part, basically says that it's when we talk about in part, it's insubstantial part. Have I got that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, insubstantial part. And then there's another one that talks about defining mental harm, right? And instead of it just being serious harm, it's permanent mental impairment, right? So it appears to be a more significant requirement, essentially, than what others view the language to be. But then the declaration really goes to something that Sean said earlier, right, which is that the President of the United States will not deposit the instrument of ratification until after legislation has been enacted to implement the treaty. Now, that's not crazy. That's not something that hasn't happened in other areas. I mean, and the United States treaty practice has been that you may, in fact, get advice and consent from the Senate, but until you have the legislation that allows you to effectively implement the treaty, because that's how you're going to live up to your obligations, you can't actually deposit the instrument of ratification and become a party. That would be irresponsible, and so that's an appropriate thing. But it takes another 2 years, right, for the legislation to get passed. And that happens, I think that Reagan signed it November 5th. And then it still takes a little bit longer for him to sign the instrument of ratification and actually get it deposited. So it doesn't get deposited until November 25th, 1988. And it doesn't go into force for another 90 days under the treaty's provision. So if you go to Treaties in Force, which is, by the way, the Treaty Office's publication, not that I'm advertising or anything, but February 23rd, 1988. So that is, 1989 rather. So that's sort of the story of the ratification. And I think, just to tee Sean up for the next conversation, yes, I think it has changed. I mean, I think even though that was an extraordinarily challenging ratification process, I think if you look at the period when Clinton was the President of the United States, and Jesse Helms was, in the Senate and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And you look at the decade, there's a sort of just a decade during which Clinton was president, plus maybe 2 years. To this sort of calculation in the Treaty Office, and you should check these facts. But I remember it was around, about 25, 24 treaties per year, essentially, that we're getting through during that period. And then you go to the Obama administration, and what you see, and up through to now, right, is that it's a little bit, 2-point-something treaties per year. I mean, it's an extraordinarily lower number. Mm-hmm. And it is extremely frustrating, the degree to which it's become challenging to get treaties through the Senate. And when I worked for Biden, we actually got a record number of treaties through the Senate during that period. I mean, it was actually, if you counted every amendment and the fact that you had an EU law enforcement, so you had all 27, we counted it up to 90, but in the 110th Congress. But it just tells you, because obviously President Obama had a very strong interest in treaties and tried to promote a variety of things, but things like the Convention on Disabilities were just an extraordinarily challenging thing. And this issue of sovereignty and the public dialogue on these questions has really been extraordinarily frustrating in this area. Anyway, I'll say more after you.
So Sean, you've done a lot of work as the Special Rapporteur on Crimes Against Humanity for the International Law Commission. Tell us a little bit about that work, where we are with the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, and also maybe some food for thought for the audience, and then we can turn it open to questions as well, as to how people might engage on this issue.
Sure. So the International Law Commission in 2014 put the topic of crimes against humanity on its agenda. And if you don't know what the ILC is, it's 34 members coming from around the world that are elected by the UN General Assembly for the purpose of attempting to codify and progressively develop international law. And oftentimes the projects we work on do become treaties. So we did the first draft of the Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court, and that of course became a full-blown treaty in due course. So why did we put the topic crimes against humanity on our agenda? The sense was that we had a gap in the field of international law. We had the 1948 Genocide Convention dealing with genocide. We had the 1949 Geneva Conventions dealing with war crimes, but we had no treaty on crimes against humanity. At least not one focused on the building up of national laws and putting states in an interstate cooperative relationship. We do have the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute creates an international court based in The Hague, and it talks all about how that court operates and that court's relationship to state parties. But that treaty doesn't say anything about national laws, national jurisdiction, or anything along those lines. Right? So there's an incentive for a state party to the Rome Statute to adopt a national law on crimes against humanity so that they can take advantage of complementarity. But there's no obligation in the Rome Statute for them to actually do that. Their obligation really is just to be in a position to surrender someone to the ICC if the time comes. So the reality is right now we're in a world where half the world does not have a national law on crimes against humanity. We're sitting in one of those countries. And none of those countries have a treaty relationship that speaks to things like mutual legal assistance, extradition, and so on, specifically on crimes against humanity. So the ILC said, let's write that treaty, basically. And as of 2017, we finished a full first draft, preamble, 15 draft articles, annex. We sent that draft treaty to the General Assembly in the fall of 2017, and we said we're going to wait for you to give us comments. And as of today, we have comments from about 30 governments, about 30 NGOs, and about 6 international organizations that have come in. That's a fairly substantial reaction based on the projects that we do. That's a pretty good turnout of written comments. This is not just oral statements, but detailed written comments, what I do like, what I don't like about the draft that you've got. So summer of 2019, the ILC comes back. We meet in Geneva every summer. Tough work if you can get it. Meet in Geneva, and we will revise our first draft so that by the end of the summer, we'll have a second and final version of a draft convention on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity. If you're familiar with the Torture Convention, scratch out torture, plug in crimes against humanity, and at least for the time being, take away the committee against torture. And that's a lot what our convention looks like. So obligation to adopt a national law, obligation to establish national jurisdiction, obligation to exercise that jurisdiction if an offender turns up in your territory, aptidere aut judicare, you must either prosecute or extradite, protections for the alleged offender, protections for the victims and witnesses, a provision on reparation, and a dispute settlement provision that takes the approach of many recent treaties. Disputes do go to the ICJ, but when you ratify, you can opt out. It's not ideal for those that want compulsory dispute settlement, but it's calculated to have as many states in that regime as possible without preventing states joining because they can't sign up to that kind of compulsory jurisdiction. It's got a lot of stuff on mutual legal assistance and extradition as well. So what's going to happen? We send it to the General Assembly roughly a year from now, and we hope that the Assembly then takes action, probably in the form of a resolution at first, a la the Genocide Convention, and then either convening of a diplomatic conference to finalize the treaty, adopt it, or perhaps negotiate it within the United Nations itself. There's a couple different paths. There's also the path of nothing, right? Do nothing. And that's where everybody here comes into the picture. Since I was invited, what can people do? If you're a member of a government, try to lobby within your government. If you have a government, which I suspect you all do, in whatever way you can lobby your government, do that. If you are able to write about this in law review articles, in newspapers, in anything, put on your Lemkin hat, basically. Become the contemporary Raphael Lemkin. Push to try to make this happen, because there is support from governments, but it's really a lot of civil society that needs to come together to push this thing on through.
All right. On that note, I think we'll use the next few minutes, and I don't want to keep folks too late. If people have questions, maybe we can take 2 or 3 at a time, and we'll turn it over to our panelists. Okay. I see 2 hands in the back and 1 up here.
I'm Brian Murphy. Thank you, panel members. I had the privilege of serving on a working group for several years. It was led by the American Bar Association. I represent the Federal Bar Association. We had Jewish service organizations, the Armenian Assembly, many others, talking about and lobbying for the Genocide Convention, working very closely with Senator William Proxmire, who was the principal proponent of ratification. And it took several years. You were counted 40 years. 40 years. I was invited to the signing in Chicago on a snowy day. I didn't go. But I revert to what Professor Sean said a moment ago about taking a role, writing, speaking, coalescing. It can make a difference. Hopefully it won't take 40 years this time, Sean.
Great, thank you. Yeah, in the back.
My name is Nuran Chaudhry. I'm basically from Bangladesh, the country where now Rohingya refugees are sheltering. So I have only one question to that point is that we see that after the ICTR or Rwanda incident, the Secretary of State said that at that point she cannot define it as a genocide. The same thing happened when about the Myanmar, they actually persecuted those Rohingya people. They came to Bangladesh and the Secretary of State said they actually cannot term that as genocide because that is a legal terminology. So what can be done to make this legal terminology easy for the politicians so that they can understand easily that this is genocide instead of taking so much time to designate a genocide as a genocide.
Great. Maybe we'll take one more, and that way we can get a few in, and then we'll turn it over.
Hi, I'm Aaron Torp with the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. My question is about the Atrocities Prevention Board. I really know as Deputy National Security Advisor, you had some hands in that, I think. And I'm wondering about the creation of it, about the changes that it's undergone under the new administration, what worked, what didn't, and what the future might hold. You know, they're meeting less often. I know that in the Elie Wiesel Act, there was some stuff about a mass atrocities task force, kind of similar but different. And if anyone could really comment on the future of the interagency effort for atrocity prevention.
Great. Maybe one more, and then we'll...
I have a question about the prudence of allowing the colloquial definition of genocide to deviate or depart so far from the treaty definition, and how we're understanding the plain meaning of the word genocide. Like, what is worse about the Khmer Rouge going after the Vietnamese and the Chem vis-a-vis Khmer intellectual class members? Why did we intervene in Libya after the Zenga speech? And if we're going to call that as a public genocide, but the government will not do it, is this really making a ton of sense? And can you actually have a definitional provision in a treaty shift in this way where it seems to contradict itself?
Okay. So we have a question about use of terminology, particularly in the Myanmar situation with the Rohingya, APB, and this difference of the colloquial definition or understanding and the legal definition. Todd, do you want to take
some of them? In terms of persuading the government and other international actors to call it genocide, I think it goes back to sort of what Sean says, speak up in public. I think today the House passed 345 to 1 a resolution. What does it say here? The United States, this is Congressman Royce speaking. This isn't what the resolution says, but he says, the United States has a moral obligation to call these crimes genocide. Failing to do so gives perpetrators covers and hinders efforts to bring those accountable to justice. If nothing else, political activity like that can get the government to focus. There's a lot of things that are going on. The government's, a lot of centrifugal force these days. There's always a lot of centrifugal force. Get the government to at least focus on it. In the ISIS case, there were groups that commissioned their own reports. They went in and did their own reports as part of the effort to sort of try to persuade us, and they were very sort of helpful to to help make the case. There was one specific case I don't want to talk about the specific case, but I saw just recently one of the memos that one of the human rights groups wrote, and it explained to me how it is that it came to be called genocide. I thought that this was really an important thing at the time. I'm sort of reverse engineering that because I don't know some of the people who would have made the decision aren't available to talk to anymore, but I could really see that this would be a very influential thing. In terms of I think the Khmer Rouge case is really one of the fascinating things, right? The people easily think of what happened in Cambodia as genocide, but in fact, most of what happened, the majority of the killings aren't what the genocide was, right? And yet it was so awful. How could there be any conception that it's not, sort of at the highest, whatever the top echelon of horrible crimes are? How could this not be in it? And in a way, the word genocide is very important, but we have to, I think, not make a fetish of it. And it goes to the issue of the fact that something might not fit within this definition, that's a sort of technical definition, doesn't mean that it's less worthy of a response. And I think the government and people in this room, people like you, people like me, have to do sort of a better job of explaining that to the public.
Anyone want to talk about the APB? I can also talk about that.
Yeah, do you want to talk? Because I think you probably have most recent up and on.
So I worked on PSD 10, which is the Presidential Study Directive 10, which was the precursor to the Atrocity Prevention Board. And then I worked at the National Security Council on a couple of different atrocity situations that went before the board, and then also worked at state in helping to think through how the department could institutionalize atrocity prevention as a priority. I would say that The Atrocity Prevention Board is one tool. It's the one that has a name, and so it's been thingified, so people turn to it as the thing, right? But actually, it's much more about how a government, how the executive branch prioritizes atrocity prevention in everything it does. So I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that one of the most important things that I think the Obama administration did, and others have done as well, is to say this is not just a moral imperative, it's also a national security imperative. There are many reasons why it's in our national security interest to prioritize atrocity prevention, and then to put real resources behind it, which I think was initially one of the weaknesses, is that the atrocity prevention priority and the board didn't have real resources to go along with it. That changed over time, and Congress has earmarked funds for atrocity prevention. But I think the takeaway for me is not that the board was the silver bullet, but it was more a galvanizing mechanism for atrocity prevention community within each of the agencies to have a process in which to advocate and push for protection of civilians and prevention measures. I think at the end of the day, if you don't have it, people will want it, even if it didn't work perfectly. It has maintained its status, or it's continued to meet in the current administration, not as regularly, but the working level has continued to meet. One of the most important things was actually out of the intelligence community, which actually did an assessment, an all intelligence community-wide assessment of atrocity risks and rankings of countries. I think that was a really important piece of that. In the current Elie Wiesel Act, that is maintained, and I think the Mass Atrocity Task Force, which you referenced, it maintains a lot of the flavor of the Atrocity Prevention Board. It houses it within the State Department instead of the NSC, but it still maintains that flavor. So I think if you don't have it, you'd want it. And really, it actually goes back to the Genocide Prevention Task Force, which Madeleine Albright and William Cohen drafted and convened a task force that the Holocaust Museum and a couple of other organizations helped find, and that was one of the main recommendations. And so this has actually been a long 10-year bureaucratic process in which to try to push the U.S. government to have the right tools in place to make decisions in a timely way. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I'll just add a very little bit because I think that's beautiful. But to my mind, this is one of those places where I found it to be kind of a lesson of how when you care about an issue and you want to see it factored into decisions, creating an institution within the bureaucracy that does that can be extraordinarily helpful. And, you know, the example that Anne pointed to that is a good one is the intelligence community. Like, we actually organized a piece of ourselves to provide analysis and assessments. And the very fact of doing that affects a whole series of other things that you don't even think about, right? I mean, you're producing it for them, and they're making decisions in the board, and that makes sense. But because analysts are writing about it, because they're thinking about it, right? Like it sort of filters into all kinds of other analytic products. And I think that happened in a variety of different ways throughout the U.S. government as a concept. And I remember when Samantha was pushing very hard in the beginning to get this done. And I think that was a part of the idea, was really to sort of say, I think having this institution within the government can actually help us to promote this issue in ways that it wouldn't necessarily get promoted. And having that voice at the table when we encountered other issues that were not yet genocide, we'd have like a little bit of a discussion about there were a number of tools that the Atrocity Board has been thinking about, you know, for things that you could do to sort of help to deter and prevent. And that was, you know, that would then get filtered into the conversation. So I thought it was actually quite useful in some respects.
I think that's a really good note to end on, that this really, it's the prevention and punishment. And we tend to focus on the punishment side sometimes in making determinations, the U.S. government making determinations, but it really, our ultimate goal is the prevention. So I think that's a great note to end on. I would just, again, thank Mark and Wes at the American Society of International Law, and Sean as the president for hosting us this evening, and for all of you for coming out. Thank you so much.